Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge.
Hi. This episode is about how leaders can reduce feelings of overwhelm in a world of constant change. The role of values, human connection, and self-awareness to create space and shift perspectives. I'm delighted to be speaking with Patrick Regan, who is the author of Sunday Times best-selling book, Small Steps for Big Change. Patrick is also director of Brighter Days and a well-being advocate. Hi, Patrick. How are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah.
I always start at the beginning, and you have a very different beginning to the trajectory of your life than many people have had. It started off with an incident that really changed everything. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I was a youth worker at the time. I was doing a gap year actually in London, and I was a youth worker in a church, and the church had a phone call from our local school. The school had a stabbing in the playground, and they wanted the church to help get the big moral fibre of their school up. And I think the vicar didn't really fancy it because he knew how rough the school was. So sent me as a local youth worker to see what I could do, and arrived in an environment which was very different to the culture that I was brought up in. But I really tried to understand what some of the key issues were for these young people growing up in the inner city. And this one school had 65 mother tongue languages. It wasn't the kids were stupid at all. In fact, they're highly intelligent. So I started helping with literacy and numeracy. I started doing assemblies, and I remember there was this one kid, he came up to me and he was wearing a bulletproof vest underneath his school uniform. And he said, I could be dead next week. And I just experienced a lot of pain, a lot of trauma in the young people. And so I found 17 people to give me £25 a month. And I started a charity called XLP, which stood for wanting young people to excel in everything that they do. And P stood for project. And that took me on a very different journey to how I thought my life was gonna go, but a rewarding and heartbreaking one at the same time.
You were running XLP for a long time, which was quite a stressful endeavor too. Would you like to share some of the learnings that you've had? That people think that running a charity isn't as stressful as it really can be, particularly when there's so many people's lives at stake.
Yeah, it was stressful. And I think the biggest challenge when I look back now was I was faced with so many difficult situations. You know, I remember one situation with a young 15-year-old girl had taken her life in the school, and just the impact that had on the school, on the community. I also lived just down the road from where a young lad called Damilola Taylor, which most people in the UK will probably remember because he was one of the youngest knife crime victims. He had a broken bottle, he was stabbed in the leg, and he bled to death in a stairwell in Peckham. And, you know, and I used to do home visits. I used to see fist marks in the wall where there'd been domestic violence. You know, the police actually used to say we're never 100 yards away from a domestic violence case. It's the pandemic no one wants to talk about and no one knows how to handle. And I guess as a young guy starting a charity, I was like, I need to fix these things.
Right.
And I just worked so hard. I was so passionate about what I was doing because I just wanted to make life better. And, you know, there were scary moments also in that where you know, I was scared for my own well-being and health and physically and emotionally. But I think that tendency to try to fix. And then what happened was I was surrounded by so much pain. I think what I did is I absorbed a lot of that pain because I couldn't fix it. It was no one could fix it. But I didn't want to talk about my pain because I felt like everyone's pain around me trumped my pain, if you like, you know. I remember the game Top Trumps when I was a kid, you know, and I feel like we play Top Trumps of pain. We go, well, what you've been through is worse than what I've been through, so I'm not going to talk about what I've been through. You know, during the pandemic, my sister was an ITU nurse, so she saw things that no one should ever have to see as a human being. I struggled, but I would never say anything because my sister, pain trumped my pain. And then I went through what I could only describe as the Tetris moment. There was a game, I don't know if you remember a game called Tetris. It was a computer
Yeah.
game where these blocks fall out of the sky and you're trying to get them in a
Right.
straight line. Then the
I
line
played it.
disappears
Yep.
and then they just get faster. And you're like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness. So I felt like I was dealing with all these
Uh,
issues in the community. And then my own health started to deteriorate. And then my
mhm.
kids' health, my daughter Kezia got HSP, which is horrible. It lasts for
What is
6 to 8 weeks. It looks like meningitis.
Oh,
Another
gosh.
one of my daughters got diagnosed with something called nystagmus, which means she has 40% vision.
Oh,
And
gosh.
it's one of those conditions where you have to go through a huge amount of tests to find out, is there a root cause? Is there a tumor?
Okay.
Um, Dad went
I'm
through a
sorry.
cancer journey which lasted 9 weeks. It was meant to last a week. He had lost 3 stone of weight. He was in hospital for 9 weeks.
Oh, okay.
Horrendous. And then after we had our fourth child, and Diane's never had a cesarean up to that point, she had a
hmm
cesarean. She lost 2.8 litres of blood.
Ooh,
So
gosh.
really scary. And then
Yeah.
after that, I had a bit of a knee pain, and I went to the doctors and said, "Oh, what's knee pain?" And I had scans, and he said, "I'm really sorry, Mr. Regan, but you need to have major, major limb reconstruction surgery." And I was like,
What?
"What's that?" And he's like, "We're going to break both your legs in 3 places, and we're going to put an external frame around your leg. And so there'll be metal going through your leg and out the other side, but you have to do it at separate times. You can't do it at the same time because it's too much."
What was the issue with your leg?
This is the weird thing, Sophie. It was degenerative. So that made it even harder to get my head around, because this
Wow.
operation is normally done with veterans who've been blown up by landmines in Afghanistan or motorbike
Okay.
accidents. I could walk into hospital knowing that I wasn't going to walk out. And the frame would be on 6 to 18 months according to how it went.
Oh, my gosh.
I've always said to people, I've always struggled with anxiety. But I think when you go through something traumatic, it acts as rocket fuel to that issue you never quite dealt with.
Yeah.
And my anxiety was always related to health. I've spoken in front of thousands of people. It wasn't that like a lot of
Right.
people would struggle with. But health, it was my Achilles heel. I'd get a headache and I'd go to Dr. Google, and
Oh,
I'd,
okay.
I'd suddenly have a brain tumor and I'd panic, and,
No,
and
no,
I'd I'd be down at A&E with chest pains, which was stress, but actually,
and I do the opposite, which is kind of like just as bad. Well, not the competing, but I just like ignore anything, so everything's like
yes.
fine, and it's like neither of these are helpful
Yeah.
solutions.
Well, the weird thing is, when I did ignore it with the knee
Yeah.
pain, it turned out to be major limb reconstruction
Oh,
surgery. So in my head, I
gosh.
was like, "You see, I told
Wow.
everyone. I told everyone." So we went through that operation twice, and that took its toll. It took its toll on everyone and everything.
In the meantime, other people are taking care of XPL as best possible, or did you just sort of put that on pause?
There were people taking care of it. There were, but I was trying to stay involved, where I should have just probably just taken a back seat, and
Yeah.
because I wanted to feel useful, and I didn't
Sure.
want this to define my sort of next year of my life. And
Right.
so I feel like you go into those situations where you're sort of, I want to be involved, but actually emotionally and mentally I couldn't. And I always feel like a massive lesson for all of us is working out that when we go through seasons where we have limitations, that's not always a bad thing,
Right. Yeah.
but we always want to push against it. And we live in a culture that says you could do anything if you just put your mind to it. Whereas actually, there are 24 hours in a day. You can't work every single one of them.
Yep.
Some of us love admin and are brilliant at it. Others of us not so good. And I've worked
Yeah.
out over the years that actually embracing your limitations is a sign of maturity, and actually helps you flourish ultimately.
Yeah, and setting boundaries. I've been through a lot of stuff,
Mm,
and with family and friends and more, and living around the world, and which has its own stresses and need for resilience or ability to try and create boundaries and create your own space. How were you able, looking at all the kids that you were helping, and then for your own experiences, and also you had 4 kids,
mm.
and your wife who also needed some of their own space and boundaries so that they didn't get, subsumed by the challenges that you were going through physically. I mean, all of this is hard, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I think my favorite definition on boundaries is how I love you and love me simultaneously. And
Yeah.
I feel like, I think it was Mel Robbins who said, "I don't believe in balance. I believe in boundaries," and I think that's very true, because we all go through seasons of our lives where things are very busy, but actually, if we've got those boundaries in, it takes care of ourselves and it takes care of other people. But that's a hard lesson to learn,
Yes.
particularly if you're need motivated like I am, and not task motivated. And you're right. My wife suffered, and in fact, in one of my books, she wrote a chapter called "Secondhand Smoke," and it sort of came from Roy Castle, the entertainer who died of cancer through performing the trumpet in pubs and clubs across the UK, and he never smoked a cigarette ever.
Oh, gosh.
So he died of inhaling other people's smoke,
Oh,
and it feels like that's when you're in a caring profession, everyone's focus is on me because I've got a massive metal frame around my leg, and it's very obvious. But obviously, for those who are caring, it's huge. And I think when we go through bereavement, when we go through supporting others, that is a massive thing which doesn't often get addressed. And boundaries is something we learnt the hard way. We had to learn what we needed, and I think one size doesn't fit all. So though there's principles and things we can all learn from each other, it's very much based on your own personality and what you need to be able to get through and to flourish. And it's a lifelong lesson, definitely. I'm still learning.
you are a man, and I have dealt in my family with family and friends and people who are close to me with several suicides.
Yeah.
Which has been extremely difficult. Most of them are men. There are some things that we don't deal with, or the environment isn't helpful, whether it's Britain or elsewhere, to help men, whether it's seeking help or dealing with issues, or trying to work out how to take some steps, whatever they may be. This as a segue to your recent book, in fact, to talk about some of the small steps. Many of the cultural aspects limit how comfortable most men, I think, feel about admitting that they're under stress, have issues, are dealing with problems, and are not, are anxious. What would you say to that? What have you experienced, and what are some of the thoughts that you have about being able to, whether it's at work, with family things, with professional things, being able to take some steps to bring the tension down, bring the stress down, whether it's box breathing at work or much more than that.
First of all, I mean, I do a lot of training for companies around men's mental health. And so I've had this discussion with hundreds, if not more, men. And it's really interesting because you see 3 times as many men as women die by suicide. Men aged between 40 and 49 have the highest suicide rate in the UK.
Oh, wow.
Men report lower levels of life satisfaction than women, according to the government's National Wellbeing Survey. 3/4 of adults who go missing are men. 87% of rough sleepers are men. And so, like, I always ask the guys in my session, why do we think this is? And these are huge statistics. The fact that you're more likely in a certain age bracket to die of suicide than cancer, which is the same for middle-aged men. So it's something that people don't want to talk about, and we need to talk about. And, I had someone come up to me. I was speaking in Westminster, and she said, "Can I have 100 of your books, please?" And I was like, 100 of your books? And she said, "Yeah, I'm going to give them out at the funeral service of my son, who was 15. And she did, and so it's a national conversation that has to happen.
Yeah.
And actually, to be fair, people like Gareth Southgate, the former England football manager, they're trying to pioneer this conversation. And I think it boils down to that we have seen traditionally that vulnerability is weakness, where actually it's the opposite. You know, the Latin word for courage is cur. It means to speak your mind with your heart. People like Brené Brown have obviously done a lot of work on this, but the fact that to be courageous means that you need to be vulnerable. It's that connection. It's that feeling that you're not alone. And sometimes men, you get into a certain age bracket, you've got your mortgage still, you've got kids, you feel like you're letting everyone down, you're in debt, and you don't want to talk about it. So you suppress those emotions. And sometimes that can come out as rage. You know, I often say to people, anger isn't wrong. It's a sign something's going on inside you. It's like the light board on the dashboard of your car. You know, when I see the light on the dashboard of my car, I sort of think, oh, I hope that would just go away by itself and I don't have to do anything or take it to the garage, you know, and it's going to cost me lots of money.
Somehow it's just going to magically
miraculously disappear. And we do that. We do that with our emotions. We go, oh, I can't push it down. But then it will always come out because our body keeps score. Our body keeps the emotions. The trauma is there and we don't deal with it. And so dealing with it, talking about it, connecting with people is so important.
And I think there are also many people and men for this focus who it's not even that there's huge amount of debt or, you know, signs of things which are, you know, negative or you know, non-positive, but they just don't feel that they've been successful. They don't feel as good a father as they wanted to be, you know, or they don't feel that they have achieved what they needed to achieve. And that causes enormous amounts of stress, seeming to be small, but then having huge impact on how complete, confident, and you know, and that can then lead to much more of a downward spiral. I've done a lot of work on empathy, and I often actually don't use the word empathy in, you know, with large groups, particularly when there are men around, because it typically has baggage. And I feel, so I use human understanding and human connection because that's more, you know, acceptable, I guess, or seen as acceptable in a business environment. The key thing for me is really to help change the dynamic and to help people, you know, take some small steps. So I'd love you to explain some of these small steps and some of the ways that you have found that you have written up in your new book to help people change the dynamic, to reframe how they're seeing a situation, because that's one thing I have been able to do is to sort of say, okay, I'm in incredible funk. The only thing that I can do is change how I look at it because the situation isn't going to change. So what are the things that you have learned and that's become part of, you know, the core practices that you now teach to help people change how they're thinking about their situation?
Yeah, it's so interesting having this conversation. Yesterday, I was in a men's prison and a guy came up to me. I showed a video clip and he was crying and he looked at me and said, I need to look at you now because I don't want any of the men behind me to see that I'm crying. And we talked about some of the challenges that he was facing with, you know, family and some of the things that had happened during his life. And within the book, there are loads of practical tools of things that people can do. But I think one of the key things is connection. I think it really is. And sure. You know, that whole difference between fitting in and belonging, you know, we don't want people to fit in, but we need them to belong. And so I have two other guys that I meet with online now. And I realized that we can talk about football for hours. And so I said, we need 3 questions that we're going to ask each other every single week. And one of them is, what's working well for you at the moment? Let's celebrate together. Sometimes you find out who your true friends are when life is going well and they celebrate with you instead of being jealous of you. Secondly is, what's challenging you at the moment? What's challenging for you? And then thirdly is, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And I feel like having that check-in once a month, not with a doctor, not with a therapist, with some mates. I know these guys have got my back now. And and I feel like everyone needs 2 or 3 people. It doesn't have to be loads of people. The other thing I mentioned in the book, which I think was really helpful, Simon Sinek was talking about this, and he did some research that said that it takes about 8 minutes if you're in a really bad headspace to be seen, valued, and heard, to get into a better headspace. So he has this thing with his friends now where if he texts them, "Do you have 8 minutes?" It basically means, "I need you. Let's cut the chit chat and let's get to what the issue is." And I think that safety net, you know, that honesty breeds more honesty. That's the reality of it. And it allows people to start thinking differently. I think with a lot of guys, you know, I often say to them, "Who was your role model growing up?" 2.5 million children in the UK have no dad at home. So sometimes it's not dad, and that wasn't there for them. And you know, and you look at the media. You know, I grew up with the male role models were Rambo, Terminator, just these macho male chauvinists, treated women in a really terrible way, or Daddy Pig, who's just pathetic, and you know, on the other side, so. It was like, we've got to create an opportunity where people can aspire to have the conversations, and find those small steps, because big change always stresses you out. You know, in the book, I talk about our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism to stress. And that's stored in the amygdala, and that's our alert system. And the science says if you want to bring about change, you need to make the choices and the steps really small so you can creep around your amygdala. You don't set it off. Those small choices become habits, and then that's where transformation happens. And I think that whole emphasis on small is so important.
Yeah, and going back to some of the things you said about having that team, I mean, maybe it can be viewed as being like a sports team. You have a core small team that you can talk to, because I do think that is in, you know, the difference between men and women on these things, and a contributing factor to the greater number of suicides, is that women do talk to each other and talk it out. And so, you know, the identifying what it is and then being able to talk it out, it does really reduce it. Being more open about the different things that are going on in someone's life. I'd like to go to the work environment, because I think this is a place where I find, you know, we're dealing with so much that is overwhelming. There's Alvin Toffler is a futurist who I admired tremendously, and he wrote Future Shock and The Third Wave. And the Future Shock he wrote first in 1970, saying that all the changes that are coming, that are starting and coming, and he saw basically all of the stuff that we're dealing with now, is too much for us. It's too much for us humans. But there's a lot of overwhelm in our professional lives, whether we're leaders, middle managers, or, you know, on the front line. There is so much that is going on that is changing, AI, you know, all of this that is happening. Or can I actually get a job? I've sent out 1,000 CVs. Can I get a job? Or AI is going to, you know, take my job. What are the things that you're seeing in these professional spaces where you're talking about how to be able to reduce the levels of anxiety and stress and be able to deal with this? Because this level of change, this level of sort of like work is much more dynamic. You know, operations are going to be changing more dynamic. This situation is not going to change anytime soon. So what do you recommend?
One of the things that I've been studying over the last couple of years, so I'm an accredited teacher with the Centre of Compassionate Leadership.
Oh, okay.
And so we really talk about what's it look like to lead with and for compassion. And so leading with compassion is often, I guess, what people would see as the typical nurturing, belonging, psychological safety, where you create an environment where people can speak without thinking, oh, I'm not going to get the promotion, or I'm going to get told off. So you want to create that psychological safety within your organization, because that actually leads to more creativity and innovation and people feeling seen, valued, and heard. The leading for compassion, because everyone goes, oh, compassion, that's quite a weak word. Well, actually, it's a fierce word. It's a courageous word. It means that you do have to confront some of that cultural, systemic stuff that is in organizations. Because, you know, people often book me to come and do tools to wellbeing, and I can give them like 20 different tools. But if the culture, and I sort of define culture as the way we do things around here, is burning people out, I can give them a load of tools, and probably what they're doing a year or two is leave, because they'll go, actually, I'm doing all this stuff and I'm still feeling it. It isn't that I'm going to leave. And so I think workplaces are starting to wake up and going, we need to have a conversation. We need to be thinking a lot more around, the structure, the workload, the job design. We need to be thinking about the manager's capability and organizational support in the right way. Have we got it? What is an inclusive behavior? Everyone talks about being inclusive. What does that actually look like? Do our managers have those skills, which means that the quietest person in the room feels like they've got a voice, and they're not intimidated and they're listened to? And are we being transparent? Are we modeling that? Or do we model a culture which is like, we often say, a teacher said to me, I often feel like teachers, the ones that get praised are the ones that go beyond the call of duty, which basically means they work every evening and ignore their kids.
Yeah. Right.
But they're the ones that get praised, and the ones of us that are trying to put boundaries in, who can't do it, everything that's being asked of us. And so it's a massive conversation that needs to happen within the workplace. And I think things are starting to shift a bit. I've felt in the last year or so, people are starting to have more of these conversations. And I think that's really important.
I also have empathy for the leaders now, because so much is changing and they have to basically go through the digital transformation, AI supercharged, at the same time as trying to work out how their business is still going to compete and take on all these, adopt all these different changes and try and then be more understanding, more compassionate, more empathetic towards their employees. And so many people within the organization are not trained either to be a leader or trained to really be able to tap in and tune into their teams. So it's a lot. It really is a lot. And so I think one of the things for me is just shifting some of the mindset.
Absolutely.
Because it's the mindset, but it is hard. How do you help shift people's mindset? Because yes, if the culture isn't there, a lot of these ideas or a lot of your talks are going to fall relatively flat, or there'd be an eager kind of like, oh yes, that's exactly kind of the environment that I want. But if it isn't really understood or if it isn't modeled, it isn't going to happen. How do you try and change that? Because it's the leadership who do have to set the example.
I think you've said it. It's the leadership that have to set the example. I think a lot of it comes from the values of the organization. I always find it quite interesting when I ask people, what's your values? When I'm in a management team, and two things happen there. Okay. One is people start to Google it, which I always find quite funny. You literally see their phones like appearing under the desk, and they're like, I can see them what they're doing. They're literally Googling the company's values. Or two is that they're put on posters everywhere.
Right.
And then we're like, have you operationalized any of those values? Have you got a KPI for those values? And they're like, no, not really. But I'm like, Susan David's done some brilliant work on this, and she talks about values as being the compass which helps define decisions. So, a classic one is, if my number one value is relationship, and particularly with my family, and I could have a big house, I could have a lovely car, but if I'm working every hour God sends me and I'm not seeing them, I'm not successful. And I'm not contented, because I'm not living true to my values. And so I think this whole thing around defining value, because I think success is actually living true to your values. I'd rather earn less and be true to my values than earn more and be untrue to my values. And, we took a decision as a family to downsize our house 18 months ago, because my wife at 52, she said, I've always had this passion to go back to university and train to be a midwife. And she's like, it's been there for years. And I was like, well, I've been in the charitable sector now for 30 plus years. I'd really love to run my own business, and I'd love to go back to my first love, which is communication. Because when you grow a charity from small to large, you end up into HR and fundraising and that. Yeah. I just love speaking about things and trying to make them accessible to people, Right. And so it was a big decision, but we're happier and we're following our passion and our purpose.
Love that.
And I think it's really important that companies grapple with values.
So that also means going back to where these things start, like empathy and compassion start with oneself,
Yeah.
right? And you have to have enough self-awareness. Empathy starts with you, but then it's about everybody else.
Yeah.
The point being is to really have company values, people need to have much more understanding of their own values,
Yes.
of I wouldn't go so far as to love yourself. Yes, that is incredibly important, and
Yes.
most of us don't.
Yeah.
We try and learn to. So some of these things are quite hardcore or sort of deep that we need to be trying to get there.
Yeah.
Really becomes that much more important because our lives aren't as stable, much more dynamic. There's much more change. There are many more opportunities and challenges for us. So I think, trying to get to who we are becomes that much more important. So on that self-awareness, on the values, I would imagine that you worked out your values probably with your wife and maybe even before that because of the things that you were doing and because of the situations, and that helped ground you potentially. I don't want to speak for you, but because you were dealing with so much pain, and I'd love to understand, how you did come upon them, whatever they may be, but also how to help people on that journey, and because that will help more people in corporations understand the value of living them and bringing them out, because it really is, core. It is what determines how people act when nobody's listening and nobody's watching.
Yeah, and who gets the credit as well, and like that famous quote, and which is very, very true. I think when you're younger, you often take on the values of your parents because that's what you're used to. And then you go through experiences that then start to shape your values and what's important to you. And I think you need to be exposed to those experiences. And it was interesting. So for me, when I was 16, I did this 2-week outreach in London. I signed up. I just wanted to do something different. And so I worked with the homeless for 2 weeks. And I remember we went under, it was South Bank. There was a place called Cardboard City where there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homeless people.
Yeah.
And I sat in a circle, and one of the homeless people had begged enough for a hamburger, but the thing that got me, they were passing the hamburger around the circle and everyone was taking a bite. And then they gave it to me, and I was like, what are you doing? Like, I have everything, you have nothing that you're sharing with me. And on the walls of Cardboard City were written the walls in massive red paint. Someone had written the words, "Welcome to reality." And I felt like that experience shaped the rest of my life.
Right.
And because I realized that there was something about my common humanity, which meant that when I was sitting with these guys and I was listening, and I think you're right, that Stephen Covey, who says most of us listen with a view to respond rather than truly listen. And we're already thinking about our response before they've finished talking to us. And so my daughter now is 17, and like I say, she has auditional needs, and we moved house so she could get nearer to a bus stop and be a bit more independent. And we spent a whole summer teaching her how to get on the bus and how to see the sign and everything.
Okay.
And she's done so well that 3 months ago, she did her own outreach to Estonia. And she went to Estonia. She flew by herself.
Oh my goodness.
She went there.
You just gave me goosebumps.
And again, I've seen the same thing happen with her. She's starting to go, Dad, this is what I want to do. I want to commit myself to helping those who are on the margins of society. And so I do think there is an exposure to something different sometimes, to the sort of the world that sometimes that we've been maybe brought up to, maybe been used to, and different cultures, different experiences that challenge our own way of perception. Because we all have biases, right? We always have our conscious bias and our unconscious bias. And sometimes I would say it's really hard to dislike anyone close up. It really is. When you hear their story, their backstory, why they've done the thing. That's a lovely way
to say. Yes, yes. And that's the whole thing with empathy. Once you actually understand someone, you don't have to be friends.
No.
But you understand them more, and then you also where you connect, whether it's the same football team or both love dogs, it doesn't make it like then you start connecting, and then you can understand the person much more. It's a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think that's so true. And I think for me, faith was important growing up, but I struggled with it, and in so many ways, particularly when my life hit so much suffering, and there was so much suffering around me, and the dogma and some of the other stuff. But then it was interesting. I guess recently I've just sort of gone right back to basics, where this whole idea of love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And that loving your neighbor as yourself, there's two things there. Caring for other people really, really, because kindness is the best drug, right? Kindness does things that paracetamol can never do. It really does. But actually caring for yourself as well. So that self-compassion, and which I guess my inner critic is something that I definitely need to work on quite a lot. But actually having the strategy now of going, actually, I have a strategy to deal with that. And I think it's been huge for me.
I would also say that kindness, because you mentioned kindness, there's a lot of mention of kindness in your book. And people still say to me, empathy is about being nice and kind. And I'm like, well, actually not, because there are actually some very manipulative, empathetic people. However, if you want to have a long-term strategy, compassion, empathy, when you're dealing with people, when you're working with people, it is not to act in a short-term way, but kindness actually is that long-term strategy so that you actually have a better relationship, that there's more feeling of belonging, so there's more psychological safety and trust, which helps everything, which benefits you as well. So, Pato, we covered so much. Here is the book. There's going to be a link to it in the show notes. What haven't I mentioned? What haven't I asked you that's in the book that you think really people need to understand, to take away, to noodle over, that's going to help them take some small steps, recognize that things aren't necessarily as unsurmountable, or if they are pretty insurmountable, how then to deal with it, tomorrow, next week, and in the coming months ahead?
The book is interesting because I think for me, it came out of a time in my life where I was totally exhausted, and I was playing that game with my wife, which is guess who's the most exhausted game, and I was trying to trump her with my levels of exhaustion, and she was just listening, and then she just went, well, she said this. She went, "That's all well and good, but at what cost to you?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She goes, "You're winning, but you're always losing." And I was like, what do you mean by that? And she goes, well, you're doing the thing, but at a great cost to your own mental and emotional health.
Wise words.
And this little mantra came to me: start small, create space, think differently. And I think the start small we've already covered, but small acts of gratitude. I found gratitude is nature's solution to anxiety, And Karen Vivach, psychologist, she describes gratitude as hunt the good stuff. I love that definition.
Yes.
Because it doesn't mean bad stuff isn't there, but it means you go looking for the good stuff.
My mother suffered a lot of depression, and I gave her the gratitude diary, right? So every morning you have to write the things you're grateful for. It really works. I mean, it's a very interesting psychological, not tricking your brain, but when you hunt for the good stuff, it does shift how you feel about
absolutely.
things.
Life is less about mountains and valleys and more about railway tracks. There's always good stuff and there's always bad stuff. And you have a choice where to focus, and they often go alongside each other, because life is rarely totally 100% awful or 100% good. So you have to work through that. I think the creating space was like Sahel Bloom said, creating space is like rocket fuel to your mind. It's like you need that space, and not just like time management stuff. It's like space from your inner critic. What does that look like? Can we listen to our inner coach? Can we listen to our inner mentor? Can we replace those voices that draw us down? In the book I talk about space for doubt, because the most certain people in the world scare the hell out of me, because they literally 100% certain that they are right. Some of the worst things in history have been achieved by certain people. And you said it earlier about self-awareness. I think that is the number one key for a good leader, is self-aware.
I agree.
And And then the last one was think differently, which was really challenging, thinking differently about power, thinking differently, how do we use power? Power's there. We talk about sex, money, and power. We talk a lot about sex and money, but the abuse of power,
Yep.
is huge. Manipulative control, cohesive
Yeah.
control is huge. And yet, how do we use our power with and our power for, rather than our power over, which is the traditional use of power? And then thinking differently about the future. Yeah, I feel overwhelmed a lot because I look at the news and there's nothing cheerful on it. There's nothing good on
Right.
it. My wife said to me, the other day, she said, I do think there's more undeserved good than undeserved bad. And there are so many kind people out there doing some incredible things, and you only have to go to the school gates to look at parents waiting for their kids, or go to a hospital waiting for seeing thousands of people just begging their loved ones to get better. And
Yeah. Yeah.
there's some incredible stuff over there, and we need to harness that and to see real community grassroots transformation.
I actually asked my daughter, who's 19, a few things that made her friends and her feel anxious or created stress at different moments or sort of over time. Number one was how much bad that you see, on social media. What the clickbait is, because you go for that. You do the sort of doom scrolling through the bad stuff. But particularly for younger people, when they don't have any context to kind of go, actually, it is context, it's clickbait, it's put there to trigger you. Not only social media, but, a lot to do with the environment that is really creating a lot of anxiety in younger folks. They have more language in some ways about how to communicate what their issues are, but it isn't necessarily received or understood by older generations. The lack of translation between sort of older generations and younger generations, how can I listen differently to understand the context that my kids might be feeling or might be experiencing, and how I can deal with that. What are your thoughts there? Because I think mental health issues, young people, at school and then going into the workplace, it's a big issue right now.
It is a big issue. And I think, you touched on a lot there. I think social media will put you into an echo chamber as well.
Yeah.
So what will happen is you will just hang out on social media with all the algorithms with people that probably see the world very similar to you. So we've lost the ability to debate and disagree well. I often say to people, if I used to play football, when I used to go after football, we used to go to the pub and we have a drink. We used to disagree on everything, literally everything. Like banter, there'll be arguments. But the next Saturday, we were on the same team. We would run through a brick wall for each other.
Right.
And because we had a relationship and we trusted and we knew where each other were coming from. But the echo chambers that people are living in now is, and like you'll know with your work with empathy, it's so hard to get people to see other people's perspectives and stuff. So I think that's a real challenge. And I think our young people, I've got 4 kids myself, and just seeing it's just so relentless, the pressure on them. We have an education system that is basically based on reward and punishment. And so my daughter's additional needs, she doesn't fit that. And yet I said to her head of year, if there was a GCSE in kindness, what do you think my daughter would do? And she said, Mr. Regan, if there's a GCSE in kindness, then your daughter would get an A. And she did actually far better in her GCSEs than any of her teachers thought she was going to do. But actually, the perfectionism that is in social media, that it's like a moving target. You can't hit it. It's impossible. And so, that's why I do think the things that we call soft skills, which are actually the skills I always look for in an employer. I always say to people, I've interviewed hundreds of people, and I always go for the 3C rule, character, chemistry, and competence. And I always feel like competence could be taught. But the character and the chemistry thing, that's harder. And so we've got to provide that level of support. But I think also we've got to have those big conversations around education, how we're nurturing our young people. Our young people do not want to burn out the way we did. There was an interesting thing in The Guardian recently that said, we suffered from FOMO, fear of missing out. young Generation Z are going, we want JOMO, the joy of missing out. We don't want to go through everything. We don't want to sacrifice our family and our career, on our career.
Right. Because for what? They look at us and they're like, I don't want that. Really? Are you kidding? No.
No, thank you.
And also there were so many choices. There was so much going on. I don't even know where I would start. So I'm going to look for something that really I'm passionate about because there are also so many choices. And then I can actually have a better time than you guys did.
And the key word you said there, wasn't it, was passion. And what am I passionate about? And I think that when you can tap into that with a young person, then you start to see the energy, because that's then they get inspired and they see the difference. One of the things I loved about the last bit of my book, I wrote a few stories about thinking differently, about how you use your skills. And there was a really beautiful story about these 3 Muslim girls in Afghanistan who were really into mechanics. Okay. And they started thinking differently. How can I use what I'm really passionate about in the service of the world? And in Afghanistan, landmines were often dismantled by children, which why there's so many limbs missing and children that are so damaged. So they designed a robot. So now landmines are dismantled by a robot, which then designed by these 3 Muslim girls, that then goes and dismantles. So there doesn't have to be these injuries anymore. Let's think differently. Let's think creatively. Yeah. But for that, you need space. And we're so overwhelmed all the time with the Tetris stuff that we have to be intentional about creating space. And that may look different for different ones of us, but that's what we need to do.
Oh, beautiful note to end on. Patrick, thank you. I really appreciate all that you're doing and have done over the course of your life so far, and that your wife is now already a midwife, or she's still studying, right?
She's going into her 3rd year. Yeah.
She's in her 3rd year. Okay, well, go for it, Diane. And I'm really excited about that, making that choice at this point, and for you and all your family. And I love the fact that your daughter is choosing that path. So thank you very, very much. And as I said, the book, this book, and other books of yours are going to be in the show notes, and I look forward to sharing that. So thank you again.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks again so much to Patrick Regan, author of best-selling book Small Steps for Big Change and director of Brighter Days. You can find out more about Patrick on LinkedIn and go to brighterdays.life. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also write a quick review wherever you watch or listen. For regular video updates, curated, useful articles, research and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter on Substack or LinkedIn. Thanks for watching. Until next time.